Imagine a spiral of fire rising above a dark ocean. At an altitude where the air is thin, one of the 4 engines on a new B-29 suddenly burst into white flame, burned through the wing, and left the crew with the knowledge that their fate was sealed. It was not enemy fire, but an internal blaze. Hard to believe that the most expensive aircraft of the Second World War, costing 50% more than the atomic bomb project, could kill its own people more often than the enemy. To grasp how this dark reason for the death of B-29 crews arose, we must go back to the late 1930s. Army planners dreamed of a very long-range bomber because the B-17, for all its toughness, could fly only about 2,000 miles, and the coming war demanded a 5,000-mile reach. Orders for 1,600 airframes were placed before the first prototype was even built. This rush, driven by fear of Britain's fall and uncertainty in the Pacific, meant that engine and systems development lagged behind the ambitious airframe, and that delay planted the dark seed of future tragedies. The B-29 was revolutionary. A pressurized cabin, remote turrets, analog calculators, radars, and a crew of up to 11. On island runways in the Pacific, these machines took off weighing almost 130 tons, carried up to 10 tons of bombs, flew above 30,000 feet, and relied on 4 brand new engines producing 2,200 horsepower each. At its heart was an 18-cylinder twin-row radial that looked perfect. It promised immense power and used a light magnesium crankcase, but its double row of cylinders was packed tightly under the cowling, so cooling of the rear row was poor and prototype flights rarely lasted more than an hour, demanding constant changes of carburetors, exhausts, and even whole engine. The first prototype flew uneventfully at first, but within 3 months the list of modifications included 16 engine replacements, 22 carburetor changes, and 19 exhaust revisions. The average test flight lasted just over an hour, most of it spent fighting problems and returning to base. The second prototype's fate became a symbol of the dark reason. In December 1942, 6 minutes after takeoff, the 4th engine caught fire. Despite the pilot's actions, it could not be extinguished, and after limping back, the crew learned that another engine had just started burning and a third was about to fail, though each had only a few hours of service time. But the real horror came on February 18, 1943. During another test flight, an engine fire engulfed a wing. 3 crewmen bailed out too low, and the heavy aircraft crashed into a meatpacking plant, killing everyone on board and 20 people on the ground, proving that the problem was systemic. From then on, pilots joked that Curtiss Wright would kill them before the Japanese did. The statistics were merciless. Of 414 B-29s lost in the Japanese bombing campaign, 147 were shot down by flak and fighters, and 267 burned or crashed because of engine failures, takeoff accidents, and other mechanical causes. For every aircraft lost to the enemy, almost 2 were lost to accidents. More than 2/3 of the losses were internal, and that is the dark reason B-29 crews were doomed. The magnesium case saved weight, but when engine temperatures reached 300 degrees Celsius, the metal ignited with a glare like a magnesium flare, reaching about 5,600 degrees Fahrenheit, and in 87% of fires on board extinguishers could not stop the blaze. Observers described a blinding white flash. The wing, structure, and fuel tanks crackled and burned like fireworks. Metal melted and dripped into the slipstream. The smell of burning magnesium mixed with synthetic oil smoke, and the cabin filled with heat that blistered paint. Why use magnesium at all? Engineers wanted to save every kilogram because this was the first pressurized bomber and weight was vital, so magnesium seemed an attractive but treacherous replacement for steel, and no aircraft maker ever used it again. The cylinder arrangement made things worse. The double row in narrow cowlings hindered cooling of the rear cylinders. To prevent overheating, crews constantly watched cylinder head temperatures and adjusted cowl flaps. In the hot climate of Saipan and Guam, the engines overheated even while taxiing, and the plane had only about 20 minutes to get off the ground and into the climb before the temperatures spiked. In the tropics, heat and humidity increased the risk. Takeoff became a balancing act between overtemperature and loss of thrust. At altitude, another hazard appeared, a powerful jet stream of up to 200 miles per hour, unknown at the time, which shattered formations and deflected bombs so that only 1 in 3 aircraft hit within 5 miles of the aiming point. Crews had to choose, fly higher and risk overheating, or stay low and face fighters. Add to this the lack of experienced instructors, there were none at first, and even Curtis LeMay halted the entire force for retraining, and you see that pilots flew against physics and their own machines. Even the weapons they proudly advertised were deceptive. 4 remote turrets and a tail mount with a 20mm cannon were controlled by heavy network computers, yet they often jammed. Turrets could slew 20 degrees and dump all their ammunition uselessly, and an upgrade to track motion caused several raids to end, with bomb bay doors riddled by friendly fire. The front 4-gun cluster had poor ballistics and a blind spot to head-on attack, and the electronic sights were unreliable. Because of this, in February 1945, All turrets except the tailgun were removed, and the lighter B-29B proved that speed and altitude were safer than relying on mechanical marvels. But that decision came too late for many crews. The company that built the engines, Curtiss-Wright, was in turmoil. Engineers moved to other projects, problems were not delegated, and build quality suffered because of low wages and a lack of skills. A congressional commission found managerial incompetence and high turnover, so it is little wonder that the factories delivered a newborn of aviation with major congenital faults. Only when the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was brought in did engineers tear apart the engines, measure heat flows, lengthen cylinder heads, add baffles, and improve the cowl flaps. They even redesigned the fuel delivery so the mixture was evenly distributed and did not ignite the magnesium supercharger. And as a result, performance increased by 38%, which could add 10,000 feet of altitude or 35,000 pounds of payload. But engine life still seldom exceeded 265 hours. General Curtis LeMay arrived and decided that instead of high-altitude daylight raids, it was better to fly low at night with incendiaries. He ordered most of the defensive guns removed, saving weight for fuel and bombs. And in March 1945, the burned-out districts of Tokyo proved the effectiveness of that doctrine, and overheating declined. But the men in the cockpits had already paid dearly. Meanwhile, the crews kept joking about the company that was killing them, and every takeoff was accompanied by prayers. They smelled fuel, listened as the roar of the engines rose during takeoff, kept hands on the cowl flap levers, watched temperature gauges, and knew that even without enemy fighters, their lives hung by a thread. The dark reason for the death of B-29 crews also lay in psychological strain. Despite pressurized cabins and oxygen, hits and decompression produced sudden fog inside, loss of visibility, and the threat of hypoxia, and later in Korea, pilots were taught to pressurize their breathing to avoid passing out. Fires could even break out while parked. Magnesium reacted with fuel vapor, and high humidity accelerated corrosion. Technicians lined the engine bays with tin shields they called pie plates, but the flame ate through them in seconds, and pilots feared their own motors more than Japanese interceptors. Why did the armed forces continue to use this machine despite such statistics? The answer is simple and terrifying. It was the only aircraft capable of delivering a massive load across an ocean, and without it, carpet bombing and the 2 atomic strikes would have been impossible. The crews paid the price, and their hard-earned experience taught how not to repeat disaster. Over time, the B-29 became part of the nuclear era. A special silver plate variant carried no turrets, but could carry Little Boy or Fat Man. The crews of Enola Gay and Boxcar went through the same school of overheating and fires before their aircraft were stripped of extra weight for the missions that changed history. At the end of the war, B-29 production was shut down as quickly as it had been started. The last aircraft rolled off the line in May 1946, but by then, the B-50 had been developed with a different engine, completely abandoning magnesium, a silent admission of past mistakes. Yet the memory of the dark reason for the death of B-29 crews remain. The stories of people who fought burning engines, pulled charred comrades from cabins, wrapped hands in asbestos tape to keep flying, and hummed quietly over the ocean at night should remind us of the price of progress. Every time you see a polished fuselage on a museum ramp, think of the heat, noise, and magnesium smell that killed more people than Japanese shells. That memory helps us understand that heroism is not always about combat. Sometimes it is about stubbornly working against physical limits when the aircraft itself becomes the enemy. The dark reason B-29 crews were doomed lay not in enemy sights, but in faulty engines, inexperience, technical ambition, and managerial chaos. It reminds us that revolutionary achievements are paid for not only with money, but with lives. And it is important to remember this when we admire polished aluminium and graceful line. This tale of scorched wings and failed motors may seem distant, but it sounds a warning even today. Why is it so important not to forget this story after so many decades? And what lessons does it carry for our time? We can only admire the endurance of the people who in March 1945 descended toward Tokyo through smoky night skies, knowing that every engine start might be their last. And when another museum visitor runs a hand over the fuselage, let them remember that beneath the smooth skin lay the dark reason B-29 crews were doomed, and appreciate the courage of those who sat at the controls. This video is purely educational and documentary in nature. It contains no ideology or propaganda.